The author and pastor Eugene Peterson gives this definition of what it means to be a pastor, and I offer it this morning. You may like it or you may not like it. He said, the church is a community of sinners, and one person is called from among this community of sinners, one sinner, one from among the sinners, from all the sinners, with the task of paying attention to God. So I offer these coming minutes in that spirit. I am a sinner. We are all sinners who's been given the task to pay attention to God. I am struggling to be faithful to the living God as much and probably more than anyone else. The Seleucid king, Antiochus IV, reigned in roughly the same area that Nebuchadnezzar reigned, but 300 years later. And a lot happened in those 300 years, and we won't go over those 300 years. So good news there. You can look it up if you're interested. And Antiochus IV decided that everyone should worship like he worshiped. Everybody in his empire should worship like he worshiped. And so he set up in the temple in Jerusalem an altar to the Greek god Zeus, and demanded that everyone worship, all the Jews worship Zeus. Does that sound familiar? Antiochus, the Jews who lived at that time drew comfort and encouragement in the story that we heard this morning in their resistance to Antiochus. Antiochus was like Nebuchadnezzar for them, and they drew strength from that story. And so the book of Daniel was actually compiled at the time of Antiochus' Epiphany and the time of of his rule. And there was a rebellion that grew out of that, and it was inspired by the book of Daniel. Idolatry, that a man to commit idolatry, was central to Antiochus' reign, and there were those in the Jewish community who wanted to assimilate, who wanted to accommodate, who wanted to say, well, it's okay if we worship Zeus. We can still be Jews, and this is all right. So they wanted to do that, but there were those who said, no, there's a line here. We will not worship. Let it be known, we will not worship the god Antiochus that you have set up, the statue, the altar that you have set up in the temple. Idolatry is an odd topic for those of us, for us moderns. I have spent most of my life, I think, believing that idolatry is not really an issue in modern times. When I read all the Hebrew prophets and all these diatribes condemning idolatry and false idols, and when I read the Ten Commandments and the graven images, I think to myself, I am so glad we don't live in a time when we have graven images and false idols where idolatry is not an issue. And when I read the prophets, I gravitate to the part that talks about peace and justice and the relationships that we have with each other, and that's the important thing there. This idolatry business, this is completely irrelevant. But as I have gotten older, I have come to the conclusion that idolatry is the most pressing issue of our times. I have your attention. That's good. You want to know what's wrong with the world? It's idolatry. Jesus, you heard of Jesus. Jesus gave the idol of our times a name. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus said, you cannot serve two masters. You cannot serve God and mammon. You must choose between one or the other. And the God of our time, the chief god in our pantheon of gods in our modern age, is mammon. It is demanded of us that we worship mammon as surely as Nebuchadnezzar demanded that all the peoples worship the statue that he set up on the plain of Dura those many years ago. Mammon is an Aramaic word. Jesus spoke in Aramaic, but the New Testament is in Greek. And sometimes there are Aramaic words that aren't translated into Greek in the New Testament, and they usually then are left the same in English. Well, some English translations will change them. The NRSV says wealth. You can't serve God in wealth. Some translations say money. But mammon was an Aramaic word that meant money or ill-gotten wealth, and also kind of, in a sense, was personified. And Jesus was giving the name mammon kind of an identity as an idol. Mammon, in the mind of Jesus, in the text in Matthew 6, was an idol and served as a kind of object of worship. You cannot worship God in mammon. He personified wealth and money as mammon, as kind of a god. And if you Google mammon, if you want to Google mammon, don't do it now, I ask you, but if you want to Google mammon, you will find all these images, these paintings over the years of statues of mammon, and people worshiping at the feet of mammon. So it's captured our imagination as the god of our time. Now you may be wondering, where have I seen a giant statue of Mammon, and where has anybody demanded that I worship that statue? I don't know. Maybe that's happened to you. It's not happened to me. How is it, preacher, that you can say that worship of Mammon is demanded of us? How can you say that? How does that work? Well, I'm going to give you a little bit of a taste of that. A lot could be said about how worship of mammon functions in our society, and it does function in our society. I'm going to give you a little bit of a glimpse of that. Now, idolatry is not just the worship of an idol. Idolatry is a political, cultural, social, and economic act. And idolatries have systems of idolatry. They have their own logic and their own coherence. And it is the idolatrous system of mammon that dominates our age. So two examples, just two, out of what could be many examples, two examples that I hope kind of capture your imaginations and help us to see a little bit how mammon works and how we come to worship mammon. The first is mammon insists that our relationships with each other and with the created order and with God be contractual or transactional. That they be transactional or contractual. Because they can be then valued in a particular kind of way, and they can be monetized. So the news is filled with illustrations, and our lives are filled with illustrations of this. And I'll give a favorite one recently. The Pacific 12 Conference, it's a conference of colleges and universities on the West Coast that has existed for 100 years, I think. Is that right, Tim? 100 years. I see you. My fellow West Coaster over there. I grew up in was in Pac 8 country when I was growing up, which dates me. It's now the Pac-12 conference, and it's about to fall apart. And everybody's harumphing. You read the media, there's all this harumphing going on. Wow, what's going on with all those greedy college presidents and college boards? They just want money. So if you've been following this, and some of you may have been, and some of you maybe are clueless what this is, but these conferences get a lot of money for showing their football games on TV. So they get these massive, multi-billion-dollar contracts with TV networks to show their games on TV. And of course, they're trying to get the most money out of their football programs that they can possibly get for their universities. And that's the way the system works, right? And so there are these universities on the West Coast that began to see, we don't have our TV contract's ending, and we don't know what's coming up next, and where's our money going to come from? How are we going to get money? And so 4 of them are joining the Big Ten Conference, which used to be a Midwestern conference, for those of you who are paying attention. It's not anymore. But the reason they're doing that is because the Big Ten Conference has a contract, a transactional relationship with TV networks that give them lots of money, and those universities on the West Coast want to be a part of it. Now, the harumping in the media is, well, what's going on with that? Why are these big universities? They're so greedy. All they want is money. Well, yeah, they got to run their programs. All they want is money. Why are they doing that? What about the relationships that these universities have built over 100 years? How is it, somebody asked me yesterday, how is it that the University of Oregon is going to have a conference game with Rutgers in New Jersey, and just down the road in Corvallis, they have Oregon State, who's not a member of their conference anymore? That's crazy. What about that covenant, that connection? Well, Mammon is driving the narrative here. Mammon is saying it's about money, it's about contract, it's about transaction, and the relationship that you have with Oregon State, Oregon, is unimportant. Who cares? It's meaningless. All that matters is mammon. The other example, which I think is which we can relate to in our lives, has to do with insurance. How many of you have insurance of some kind or another? Yeah. And you have a contract with an insurance company that if something were to happen to your house, if a tree were to fall on your house, or hailstorm, for many of us, we've experienced that recently, if that happens, they will pay for the damage. You have a contractual relationship. That's transaction. How many of you are trusting that if a tree should fall on your house, the people from this community will come in and build you a new house or a new roof or repair the damage? How many of you are in that category? Anybody? I'm the only one? Not me either. No, I'm a sinner like everybody else. I have insurance. Well, I think I have insurance. Shout out to you, John, for that. The insurance relationship is transactional, and the barn raising, my community comes around in times of crisis and supports me, is covenantal. It's based on a relationship that I have with people over a long period of time, even going across multiple generations. I'm going to give a third example, and that has to do with family relationships. Increasingly, our family relationships are becoming transactional or contractual. They're becoming less covenantal. Now you can think about that. And I will say, that's as far as I'm going to go there, other than to say, I'm encouraged by families that I see in this congregation that are looking for multi-generational housing arrangements. And some of our younger families at College Mennonite Church are in looking at multi-generational housing arrangements so that grandparents and parents and children are living together on the same property or the same space. That's covenantal. That's a covenantal way of thinking. Covenantal thinking says, I am connected to the people who went before me. I have a relationship with them. They matter to me. And I'm connected with those who are going to come after me. And it's not a contractual relationship. It is a bond that cannot be monetized. So that's one example. Mammon does not like covenantal relationships and insists that everything be contractual or transactional. And that force in our society today is strong and demands that we worship Mammon in that way. The other one's trickier. It's a trickier kind of thing, and it's going to be a little bit harder, I think, for me to explain this to you. But I saw recently a report from NPR about an Ivy League researcher. That was the headline. Ivy League researcher says spirituality might be good, or is good, the research showed, is good for your mental health. Well, that bothered me. And you're going to say, preacher, why did it bother you that your relationship with God is good for your mental health? Well, one is I'm not surprised by that at all. But why is it that my purpose in life is not to have a relationship with God, it's to have good mental health? It's a tail wagging the dog article, if you will. It's not that I'm opposed to good mental health. Far be it. But the logic in the article was the logic of Mammon. When we begin to see our relationship with God as a tool for good mental health or better living or more productivity or what have you, when we see our relationship with God in that way, we turn it into, God becomes a tool. We turn God into a tool for our use that we can use for our purposes, and then we can value that tool. What is the value of God? How do we value God? And then we can place a monetary value on God. And God gets turned into Mammon. When in fact, the reverse is true, is it not? It's not that we gather on Sunday morning to worship the true and living God so that we can have a good week. My week just goes so much better when I worship. Our week is a preparation for worship of the true and living God. You see, is that make it, you got me there? The purpose and meaning of life is not to be found in seeking after these other things. It's to be found in the worship of the true and the living God. We live in idolatrous times. Idolatry, you see, is ruining us. Mammon is destroying the ties that bind us to each other. Mammon is destroying our relationship with all of creation. And most importantly, Mammon is destroying our relationship with the true, living, and eternal God. Now, that was the easy part of this sermon. Now comes the hard part. Why is it that Mammon is so seductive and the true and living God isn't enticing at all? Why is that? And that's the question that I think we're faced with. It's easy to identify mammon and say, oh, mammon, it's destroying us. That's kind of easy to do. But Jesus' commandment is not, don't worship mammon. It's worship the true and living God. That's the essence of the commandment. The problem with mammon isn't worshiping mammon. The problem of mammon is it gets in the way of our true worship. So what is it? What are the barriers? Why do we have a hard time worshiping? So I've been thinking about the Anabaptists and the connection with Dirk Willem's story, for example, and many other Anabaptists who were burned at the stake, and the story that was read earlier. Notice that Pamela did not read the whole story of what happened. The fact that the flames did not harm the three young men, in part because sometimes the flames harm. Our Anabaptist forebears were harmed by the flames. But what interests me in their stories is how awake they were to the true and living God, how present they were, how conscious they were of God's presence, of the eternal God's presence in their lives, so much so that they had the courage to do what Dirk Willems did. That they had the courage to go to the stake, to be burned at the stake, with cries of joy to their Creator. Wow. I want that. I want to be awake to the true and living God. So I've been thinking, and I think about this a lot as a pastor. I think about it for myself, to be sure, but I think about it for this community. How do we awaken to the reality of the true and living God? Sometimes I wonder if we don't try to think our way to it too much. And in my struggle to think about where to go with this sermon, the answer was right here in our prayer time this morning. Simple faith. Simple faith. The answer maybe isn't leading with our minds, leading with our thinking, as I tend to do. It's leading with our hearts, leading with conscience, and with compassion, and with simplicity. Leading with prayer, leading with singing, leading with silence, leading with a walk in the woods, to awaken our souls to the true, living, and eternal God. I said, and I'm aware, I knew this was going to be a long sermon. I said earlier, I lost my train of thought. What did I say earlier? I have to go back and see what I said. Worship is the end, right? Is the telos, is the purpose of our lives. Worship of the true and living God. We are here. We are here. What a beautiful thing. Such joy in us being here together. We are here. And those of you who are not here in this sanctuary at 1900 South Main in Goshen, Indiana, are here in spirit watching at Greencroft or on your computers or listening on the radio, we are worshiping together. And there is no more profound and more important act that we can be doing in our resistance to mammon. I want to invite us to worship, to sing praise to the living God, the true and living God, the eternal God, the one who has created all things.